Hello, my name is Ivan Taylor, and I'm from Ontario, Canada. And I'd like to show you today some work that some colleagues and I have been doing on an exploratory system dynamics model of sustainable development of the Arctic. I will begin with our problem definition, and then I'll discuss the system dynamics approach. And then I'll provide a description of the model and some results. And then I'll have some concluding thoughts. So our problem is that we want to analyze and manage competing interests in the Arctic. And these interests involve development of the Arctic, which involves exploitation of its natural resources and the use of the Northwest Passage for shipping and fishing. And then the other aspect, the other interest is sustaining the environment to support the native people and the natural life. And our intended audience is government regulators and policymakers. We use the system dynamics approach, which involves building a computer simulation of a real-life system, which we call a digital twin. And with this digital twin, we can examine policies that might have an impact on the future of the real-life system. Now, system dynamics is the simulation technique that we used, and it involves the numerical solution of highly interconnected systems of first-order differential equations. And we look at behavior over time of the important performance measures, and these behaviors can involve growth, decline, equilibrium, and two other behaviors, which is better before worse and worse before better, which demonstrate the differences and the changes from the short term to the long term. System dynamics allows us to use both quantitative and qualitative measures. However, we have to maintain unit consistency in all of our calculations. And system dynamics allows us to look at how the system will recover from shocks, and I will show you that in a few minutes. So here we have a discussion of the model where we have the environment, which is divided into the land, ocean, and ice, and the wildlife and fish. And then we have people, which involve the native population and the non-indigenous population that moved to the north to do the development. And then we have the development and the sovereignty, and this involves infrastructure to generate income on land and to protect the land in terms of sovereignty, and also shipping, which generates income and also can protect the sovereignty of the oceans around the Arctic. Here is our picture of our model. It shows us that the model is highly interconnected, and it was developed in Stella Architect. And we have 6 sectors, and over here we have the environmental sector of land, oceans, and ice. And then here we have the environmental sector of wildlife and fish. Here we have the development sector of infrastructure. And here is the development sector for shipping. And here is the population sector for the non-indigenous population. And here is the population sector for the native people. And you can see that these sectors are highly interconnected. Now, we developed this simple presentation of the primary performance measures that we want to look at in this model. And we have an idea of economic health on the x-axis and environmental well-being on the y-axis. And we begin at the current state of 1-1, which is the current situation. And then we can look at the movement in the system over time into one or more of these quadrants. And the goal is to try to move up into this upper right-hand quadrant, which has improved economic health and improved environmental well-being. And then we want to avoid this quadrant over here, which is reduced economic health and reduced environmental well-being. And then we have these other trade-off quadrants, which involve, in this case, in the upper left-hand corner, we have improved environmental well-being, but reduced economic health. And in the lower right-hand quadrant, we have improved economic health, but reduced environmental well-being. And in our model, we introduce shocks to the system where the system has a current parameter value, and at some point in time, we shift upwards or downwards a certain degree, and then that parameter value will take on that value for the rest of the simulation. The shocks that we considered are sea level rise, the non-Indigenous arriving and leaving rates, the wildlife birth, death, migration, and poaching rates, the fish birth, death, migration patterns and catch rates, the environmental degradation and regeneration rates, the ice freezing and melting rates, the infrastructure building and demolition rates, the shipping routes opening and closing, and the ships commissioning and decommissioning rates, and the fraction of ships that are devoted to fishing. And here is our control center or Arctic Command Center, which shows a dashboard where we can experiment with policies. And over here, we have policy switches to turn on various environmental protection policies. Here we have switches to turn on development and sovereignty policies. And here we have a section for native empowerment policies. And we begin with this idea that we have a certain period of unconstrained economic development, which creates income, but causes environmental damage. And here we see one of the important economic factors, which is infrastructure, which is growing over time. And infrastructure, it creates this economic well-being. We also have these detailed graphs of shipping routes and ships and air pollution here, all growing exponentially with unconstrained development. We have an idea of the non-Indigenous population growing and then reaching equilibrium. And then we have the native population declining over the period of unconstrained development. We have the fish banks being negatively affected, wildlife being negatively affected, and the environment as a whole being negatively affected by unconstrained development. So we looked at the situation where the unconstrained development went for 40 years, and then we looked at the possibility of new policies being implemented at the 40-year point and carried on for another 35 years. So we looked at a 75-year time period. And you can see here the initial time of 40 years of unconstrained development. And then we have policies introduced for native empowerment and environmental protection. And these, we did a simulation of 25 different sets of policy parameters. And you can see that there are some sets of policy parameters that move the system into this upper right-hand quadrant of favorable economic health and favorable environmental well-being. However, many of the policy parameter settings result in improved economic health, but reduced environmental well-being. And here's the detailed graphs showing the results of unconstrained development with native empowerment and environmental protection policies. And you can see that ships and air pollution are not affected because this is unconstrained development. However, the non-Indigenous population and the native population have impacts, are impacted by these policies, as are the fish banks, the wildlife, and the environment. Although notice that the environment is not affected that much. Basically, it's still in decline for all of the policies we considered. Now we looked at the possibility of adding a government regulation. So we have 40 years of unconstrained development. And then we have, at year 40, we have native empowerment policies, environmental protection policies, and constrained development constrained by government regulation. And we can see here, this is the unconstrained development. And then we have these new policy results. And we can see that some of these parameter settings lead to a positive situation of improved economic health and improved environmental well-being. But many of these parameter settings, policy parameter settings, lead to reduced economic health, although they do improve environmental well-being. So these can be considered possibly over-regulation. And then we have a number of policy settings that do not affect economic health, but do improve the environmental well-being. And here are the detailed graphs. And you can see that with government regulation, we now have various results for shipping routes and ships and air pollution. We have a new set of results for the non-Indigenous population and for the native population. And you can see that there are some improvements in the fish banks and some improvement in the wildlife, and in some policies there is improvement in the overall environment. So in conclusion, we realize that the Arctic is a complex and a fragile system, and there are many stakeholders with competing objectives. There is the natives and who are trying to protect their way of life. There's industrial developers who are trying to generate income. There's environmental protection agencies that are trying to protect the environment. And then there's governments that are trying to maintain national sovereignty. And we developed a digital twin for policy experimentation. And we looked at unconstrained development and how that may be having a negative impact on the environment. And then we looked at the possibility of introducing alternative policies for environmental protection and native empowerment. And we found that some of these policy settings led to positive results, but many of them led to trade-offs between economic health and environmental well-being. And then we looked at government regulation in addition to environmental protection and native empowerment, and found that this also, in some cases, led to positive economic growth and positive environmental well-being. However, there is the possibility of over-regulation, which will reduce the economic health, but will improve the environmental well-being. So if you have any questions or would like to find out more about this model and our work in system dynamics, you can reach me at this email address. Thank you very much for your attention.